Wow, it's tough sometimes to follow on lunch, you know, it's an interesting thing, but this is a modification of a talk I've given before, and, you know, I really have the hope here that I provide some entertainment and some provocative thought, and, you know, you can walk away thinking you got something out of it. As the title implies, the theme here today that I'm going to talk about is about disruptive versus incremental innovation. And fundamentally, two things. One, what can we learn from history in general about how to predict and work into the future? And second of all, what are some approaches to actually do it in companies today? And how, for example, are we doing it at HP? So with that, you know, one of the things I'll say is, you know, history's great inventors provide a lot of food for thought on what's possible to do in the world. A lot of people look at technology, and I work in Silicon Valley, and they say, you know, that's old stuff. The new is the new and the old is irrelevant. And I would argue, for the most part, that almost everything you see happening in the world in evolving ways in your industry and other industries, in one way or another has happened before. And that's what this talk is really going to be about. What can we take away from that? It's really, really important. And what kinds of approaches can you use? So a few things. First, let's look at some recent history. You know, when just a few short years ago, you know, who would have thought that the consumer spending online in the U.S. on Cyber Monday, you know, was at a peak? You know, 15 years ago, if you said where was most of the shopping occurring, you know, maybe you'd start to get an inkling. And many of you are probably not surprised by this, but you might be surprised by this as a comparison, which is that Chinese consumers alone on their version of Black Friday or Cyber Monday, which happens to be called Singles Day, it celebrates single people, just Alibaba alone did 4 times the business of all of the online world in the United States on Cyber Monday, okay? The reason I'm showing you this is because the world as we know it and the world as it changes is not the world that we're necessarily going to encounter going forward. This kind of thing has really significant market impacts on different industries of different types, and I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. Second of all, who would have thought that India would have put a spacecraft into orbit around Mars for less than Hollywood made the movie Gravity? For those of you who've seen that movie, they spent more to make that movie than it cost India to send a spacecraft to Mars, as an example. So the nature of the economics of what it takes to achieve certain aspirational innovations, the time frame, and other things which once in the not too distant past would have been considered unfathomable, today are actually happening, and they're happening faster and faster. And this is available, I believe, so you don't have to take pictures. Who would have thought that the world's largest taxi company would own no vehicles? You all know, of course, about Uber. Hopefully this will, let me go back there and, come on. There we go. The world's largest taxi company in vehicles. Let me tell you, it doesn't like me. Let me tell you a little story about this for a minute for those who might think otherwise. Hopefully this will back itself up. Well, I'll hold this one and just talk about the taxi thing. So when Uber started in 2010, and I'm assuming most people here know what Uber is, hopefully. When Uber started in San Francisco in 2010, in 2009, the total addressable market for car services and taxis in the San Francisco Bay Area was $150 million. Now, how many of you in innovation, when you're looking at new things, are asked to kind of assess, you know, what many industries call TAM, total addressable market? In many ways, when you're dealing with really new innovation areas, you have to throw TAM out the window, completely out the window, because TAM is an historical statement, not a future statement. Case in point, $150 million market, Uber comes in 5 years later, that same market's $550 million, just in that one city. So there was a market that had to be made, it was latently waiting. Artificial intelligence, which I put up here, who would have thought that it would have discovered a theory that baffled scientists? And this is a theory about the genetics of mutations occurring in insects that scientists were stumped for many, many years on until one of their artificial deep learning programs actually cracked the code, so to speak. Got some repeats there. So what will the future look like in 2030? One of the things we do at HP, among my colleagues and myself, when we're thinking about the future and when we're looking to drive innovation is we know what our businesses are today. We know and we think we know how we're going to evolve them as things progress. That's the everyday business of business, if you will. But we don't know what the future is, and if we don't have a view on the future, it's very hard to have a view on what we want to be in the future. So one way to do that is to really create scenarios where you look into what the future might be like in scenario set in your industry. And this is something, for example, the military in the United States and the Pentagon, they do this ad infinitum into the future to see every scenario that could possibly come up and then have some contingency plan. So the theme here, humanity will change more in the next 15 years than in all of human history. And let me give you some anecdotal examples. 50% of the global GDP growth in the next 15 years at that point in time will come from 440 emerging cities, 400 of which most people here have never heard of. Okay? So the center of economic activity will be in places that basically are off people's radar today. Not this city you already know that's getting bigger. That will be one of them, but a lot of other ones as well. Saudi Arabia, as an example, gets to the water issue that some of you here in the audience know about, might end up harvesting its fresh water, pulling it right out of the atmosphere, okay, rather than other methods. And you can imagine what the dynamics to the industries that touches would be. And then finally this one, and this I'll leave you with this theme when I go into the next part, which is over 50% of Fortune 50 companies or 500 companies today in 15 years will not be here. So the rate at which Fortune 500 companies are accelerating in their disappearance is going up, 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 up. The irony is that if you're in one, like I am, most of the people you work with probably think because you're that big company, the idea that you would ever go away is kind of unfathomable. And that is just not the case at all. All you have to do is look at companies like Nokia, 60% market share in 2001, phones, 0 today, okay? So we can never know the future, but understanding the future and megatrends in this view of the future, we think that history can help point the way. And so what we do at HP and what I'm part of, among other things, is we look at the megatrends, same ones you can look at and work through, that are transforming key elements of the economy, society, economics, demographics, and what will that mean for a potential future into which our business existence applies. So rapid urbanization, which gets to the city issue I discussed a minute ago, that might mean that there are no more country markets. There are really metro markets, large metro markets around the world. Changing demographics, the United States will have a very significant population under the age of 30 and over the age of 60, with very little workforce in between. That has all kinds of implications right there. The hyperglobalization piece, and of course the accelerated innovation. So these are very high level. In each industry we break these down for the business that we're dealing with, but this gives you an idea of how we approach things. So when we take that and say, this is great and this is interesting, what do I do with that? Or what do we do with that? My thesis is that understanding history makes creating disruptive innovation easier. And I'm going to talk about what I mean by creative disruption. And what you'll see here is there are a lot of ideas here that come from many, many other people. I can quote them as we go. But what I'm going to show you is that nothing is really new out there, and that what I'm going to share here today is a combination of ideas put together. Shakespeare said it best, I think, that what is past is prologue. That's essentially the theme of my talk today, that what has happened before will give you indications to your business in the future, even though on the surface it doesn't look at all relevant. And I'm going to make that more clear. So it has to do with opportunity, idea, and innovation, and let's get right into it. So first, what I put in here, and we'll talk more about it, is very few things out there are really, really new. And that's new in quotes. And by new, I don't mean you hadn't thought of it, and I don't mean you hadn't seen it. I mean that fundamentally, that one person over in the lab, in the corner, came up with a new idea for a new product or a new category out of the blue, and that's what drove the industry. Of course, at the scientific level and the discoveries level, there are always new things occurring. But to turn them into commercial, active business propositions are largely not new. Perspective, synthesis, and insight is really important. I'm sure for those of you who work in commercial businesses today, you know how much emphasis is put on analysis. People who go to graduate programs, people who go to business school like I did, everything is analysis. As if analysis of the past and analysis of the details will somehow lead you to a spark of innovation about what the future should be. It might give you understanding, it might give you other things, but it's not going to give you insight. Insight comes from perspective, and perspective comes from seeing things in different ways that you didn't realize before. Like you put 2 and 2 together, and all of a sudden you realize it's the number 9, okay? And we're going to talk about that today. Creative chaos, nature is the model for this. Lots of things happen in the evolutionary biological world because of the creative convergence of different things. In the world of people, business, and commerce and ideas, the more creative disruption that goes on in an environment, the higher the metrics that come out of it in terms of innovation. This is why Apple, for those of you who have heard about their new giant UFO center, where they're putting all their employees in the United States, that is designed so that everyone literally has to converge around the equivalent of the water cooler, so that people in one area bump into people in another area on purpose. And the notion is, if you can't think about something from a different perspective, you're not going to come up with something fundamentally new. So creative chaos we'll talk about. Errors are good, foster serendipity. I was talking to a few people at lunch and breakfast today, and how many of you in the large environments, chemical companies or other areas, that are very operationally driven, very much about QC, quality control, and everything else, is the word error a good thing? Generally, that speaks of bad things happening. The problem is that in very mature, established enterprises, they tend to be operationally driven, which is a good thing, and they tend to be efficiency driven and predictability driven. The problem is all of those characteristics make for bad environments for innovation. And so how do you get to the issue of fostering accidents that drive errors that are not catastrophic, that drive serendipity and perspective? We'll talk about that as well. And then finally, it's about the people, the culture, and the processes. To put these together inside a corporate environment and expect innovation to happen, you need to have the right people with the right culture and processes and these other characteristics going on. What that means is if a CEO says, I want to start an innovation group, let's start new businesses, let's take the 8 people I know who built those really mature ones in that other area and let's bring them in to do that, that's a really big mistake. Because the things that make them good at what they've been doing will not make them good at that other area. So people, culture, and processes. So what are the top inventions of all time? Anyone want to take a guess at this? And obviously, this is somewhat a matter of opinion, but what I'm going to share with you is the result of a survey, a global survey of 400 scientists, academicians, thought leaders, and other sort of leading thinkers. A couple of guesses from the audience. Top inventions of all time, top innovations. Electricity, okay. The wheel. Fire, okay. I like it. Okay. Okay. What do you, in general, all of those are on the list of the top 50, not the top 3. Let me tell you what they are. Fire, you had that right, the wheel, the printing press, and more recently, the internet. Not because there aren't 50 other things like electricity, the telephone, the mobile phone, keep on going, that have had penicillin, that have had a large impact on people, but those things have built on top of other things, whereas these things set a foundation for the rest of those ecosystems of innovation to occur. And I'm going to specifically work through the example of the printing press, probably a very topical subject for me because I come from HP, and it's one of our main businesses, but you'll see it's pretty interesting stuff. Fire, the notion that basically before there was fire, people could not control their environment. They could not manage the environment, and so they did not have time or safety to manage other things going on around them, hence creative time. Before the wheel, they couldn't move the things that they were being creative about around. Whatever they were thinking up or doing in farming or whatever the other area was, it had to stay put. It could move from this side of the village to that side of the village. The printing press, which we're going to go into in a minute, I'll save for later because the story's an amazing one, and now the internet, which essentially turns us and every industry that you represent into a data-oriented animal for the future. So let's look back at this. Gutenberg. The year is 1440 AD, give or take, and Gutenberg in Germany is famous for, quote, inventing the printing press. And whether or not you heard about this in life, or you learned about this in school, or it was anecdotal when you cracked open the old encyclopedia, for those of you who are old enough to remember those, it's not, what's fascinating about this is not that he invented the printing press. What's fascinating about this is how it came to be and what it means for the way we look at our innovations going forward, because the same themes apply. So it's 1440. Let's take a little walk back in time. First of all, it's now ancient Rome, roughly 30 BC. For those of you who might remember from history lessons, Mount Vesuvius that exploded, the city of Pompeii. It was in Pompeii that a famous Roman philosopher discovered what amounted to a wooden screw press that basically crushed grapes. And that knowledge was then put forth through the Roman Empire, and that device, essentially a mechanical contraption that compressed things, was spread around 30 years before, the birth of Christ. Flash forward to China, 1040 AD. It's now 1,000 years later, and the Chinese invent movable type. Each letter is a separate physical object that can be manipulated. So think of a stamp. When you think of all, the kinds of things that kids used to play with, at least before electronic devices, stamps, those come from the original inventions in China of type. Because Chinese and the Asian languages, as you know, are not based on an alphabet. They're based on symbolic representations of concepts. So every image is, in fact, an idea rather than having individual letters. So we had 30 BC. We had 1040. Let's flash forward again to Rhineland, Germany in the 1400s. It's the early part of the Renaissance. You have the Rhineland Basin near the Rhine River, where trade is beginning to flow between different areas. Trade like Marco Polo, who came back a century earlier from China, where, by the way, he discovered movable type from my last slide, which he brought back in his ideas and his journeys to the folks in Europe. The traders are in the area of Rhineland, Germany. Rhineland produces a lot of grapes. They realized there was a mercantile opportunity to take those grapes and produce goods for sale and trade, now that things were moving around a bit in the Renaissance. However, they were used to stomping on the grapes, and not a very efficient way to make wine, or anything else for that matter, and certainly not sanitary. And in any case, what they did was some unknown folks dug up the old notion of the Roman screw press. These were folks who read Latin and discovered the philosophers' sketches of the screw press from ancient Pompeii, put it to use crushing grapes, call it a mechanical industrialization of the wine industry in Germany, and put that into effect in a wide-mannered way. What's interesting about that is Gutenberg comes along around the same time. He's a metallurgist, a chemist, and other things, and he happens to be wandering through some of the Rhineland towns where he sees this contraption that is crushing grapes. And he, for a long time, had noted that he really wanted to be producing, he was a very devout man, he really wanted to be producing Bibles. Until this time, books were handwritten by monks. Very, very few people read. Information was not transmitted other than verbal, oral history. So Gutenberg saw this screw press, he had his knowledge of metallurgy, he learned about the movable type, and he put it all together and basically came up with the printing press, which started out, obviously, printing Bibles and getting people reading, Bibles, churches, religion, and whatnot being the core of the societies at that point in time, and people read, but more happened. You know, it would be interesting enough if that were the end of the story, but it's actually just the beginning, right? And so what I'm trying to show you is that history is like a continuous loop here. What happened next? Hopefully this will show up. So when people started learning how to read, because they didn't know how to read, and reading the Bible, they started having the experience where their vision was focusing on things right in front of their face. If you're in a pre-literate society without books that people don't read, you don't have to view things this close, pretty much ever. Certainly not for an extended amount of time. People started to realize they needed vision correction, okay? Vision correction drove some of the other folks in Northern Europe at that period to invent lenses out of glass optics to try and correct human vision so that more people could adapt to reading these Bibles. The same approach then spun off to create microscopic lenses, telescopes, and all the rest. You wouldn't basically have Galileo looking at the stars 100 years later unless you had that Roman philosopher finding that screw press. And the rest that comes from this, I'm sure you can put the pieces together. So I thought a pretty interesting example of how history always has a backstory. The backstory always involves 1 + 1 = 3. And each time you think you're done, now I have 3, next time it's 3 + 3 = 16. And that seems to be what's going on with increasing frequency in the different industries around the world, specifically because of technology. And all that the data and internet and communications era is doing today is speeding that progression up. So very little is new. Ancient Rome, that was my first thesis, if you remember. The example, whether it be the telescope, the microscope, of course, all the medical things that have come out of that, and there's an endless array and map of everything you can think of that comes out of these things that explodes into penicillin, many of the research things done these days in chemistry or what have you. All of that goes back to different points in time, one important one of which was this time in ancient Rome. Creative chaos. It took the conditions of Rhineland, Germany in the Renaissance to create enough chaos, friction of different people of different backgrounds coming together for ideas that were seemingly disparate to be together. In other words, if I want to say 1 and 1 = 3, I have to have another 1 besides my own 1 to get there. The only way I can do that is to have an injection of new people and new ideas. So when corporations talk about diversity, it's not just because they want to be politically correct. It's because diversity is also designed to breed, hopefully, in some way, a little bit more creative chaos. Okay? Second or third here, processes. You had this chaos in Rhineland, Germany, but you needed a set of processes to disseminate that into something that had commercial or economic applicability so that many people would take it up, not just a few. So you had the production and the processes of the wine industry at that time, and that in turn led to the proliferation of the presses, which led to Gutenberg, and the cycle then repeated itself from printing presses to books, from books to glasses, from glasses to, fill in the blank. And finally, the fourth thing, and this is a big one, and I'm going to talk about the pragmatics of this in your businesses, is serendipity. You need a bunch of luck. But the key is you have to put yourself in the right position to be lucky. We had a conversation at dinner about golf last night, and someone asked the other person, have you ever had a hole-in-one? And he said, yeah, and it's all luck. And I said, well, let me ask you a question. If you're, I don't know, whomever the top golfer of the moment is, and you hit thousands of golf balls a week, and you can hit thousands of them right around the hole, right in this little area, but I go out and I hit 100 a week or 50, and I hit them all over the place, the laws of probability say that the other person's going to be a heck of a lot luckier to go in the hole than I am. Okay? Serendipity. You have to be able to create the environment in which that chaos exists so that serendipitous things can happen. Things can be discovered, ideas can be brought together, and new things can be created. Versus, let's all get together and make a plan to be creative. That doesn't work. Okay? Despite what my superiors might like to think sometimes. So how does this apply to creative disruption and innovation today? What can we do with this? What can you do with this? It's entertaining, it's interesting, but how do we make this real in what we do? I'm going to give you a case example or two of how we do this at HP, where I set up and I run the company's internal incubator, among other things. So I'm responsible for new business strategy in new areas that if people in my company were to say, we don't do that, those are the areas I'm responsible for, the ones we don't do. And then I'm responsible for starting and building the new businesses that do the things that we don't do. So that someday they are the things that we do, right? Because they're never gonna be if we say we don't do them, okay? Pretty simple formula. So a couple of things, and it's kind of hard to see this, but there's an edge, there's an XY axis here, which is hard to see. Imagine the Y and the X. I want you to think about this for a second, disruptive versus incremental innovation. I've gone to a lot of companies over my life, both at HP and as a management consultant, and 9 times out of 10 when I talk to corporate management at a company of any size or shape, other than a startup, they always confuse incremental innovation with all innovation. Incremental innovation is really, really important to the businesses we have today. Faster, better, cheaper, more competitive, all those kinds of things. But incremental it is. If I make a certain process that produces 10 widgets a minute, and tomorrow I can make that process produce 20 and my competitor produces 9, that is definitely impactful. However, does that change the world away from widgets? I don't think so. So that's incremental. I'm going to talk more today about disruptive innovation. I think large enterprises are very, very good at incremental innovation. This is what Deming worked on, and everyone else in the modern scientific realm of business processes focused on incremental innovation. When I talk about it, I mean disruptive innovation. And frankly, it is something that large companies do very, very poorly, as a general rule. Why? Because that's not the business we're in, okay? Number one, you may recognize these kinds of categories. You have products and technologies that you're already in or that already exist. Number two, up on the left-hand side, fundamentally new technologies or breakthroughs. And then on the x-axis, you have existing customers or markets and new customers or markets. Most large companies are very comfortable taking their existing technologies and moving them into adjacent markets. They're also comfortable at innovating adjacent technologies and bringing them to their existing markets. They are extraordinarily uncomfortable developing new technologies and capabilities and building a new market in the upper right. The problem with that is that's where all the disruption happens. And to make that point, I call this the boundary of comfort. This is the corporate comfort boundary zone in blue. Basically, if it fits within this blue oval of this blue pie slice, generally you might say that most companies are pretty comfortable from the viewpoint of innovation. Once you start going out beyond this line and moving into the variables of new technology, new product, new market, new customers, I don't do any of those today. The risk factors are deemed too high, the unknowns and uncertainties are deemed too high, and the idea that management can invest X to get Y is too speculative, okay? However, it's these very things that threaten the very industries that said they don't do that. And I can give you example after example after example. I'm giving you the ones that are just well known now. In the car market before Tesla, it was Zipcar, which ended up getting bought, new business models and so forth. In some cases, it's technology. In some cases, it's business model transformation. In some cases, it's both, okay? My focus at HP and what I do with Silicon Valley and the rest of our company is focus on the outside of the blue bubble. The inside of the blue bubble is the domain of the operating businesses to do what they do best. And one of the important things to mention about outside of the blue bubble is that if you're a 1, 4, 6, 8, 10, 15, $20 billion company, things outside the blue bubble almost always start small, very small. Okay? And so the notion, we get this in my environment all the time, is how does that scale? And if it doesn't scale, then why is it relevant? Because if it doesn't scale right now and it's not big enough, then it's not relevant. And the answer is, it's the old analogy, where does an oak tree come from? It comes from an acorn. But acorns are acorns, they're not oak trees. So there's a time frame, a horizon, and an expectation that needs to be different depending where you're investing and taking actions along this continuum. So how do we frame at HP and categorize new disruptive ideas? HP's been around a very long time as a company. We were largely considered the first founding company of Silicon Valley. We still have the garage where Hewlett-Packard actually did their work and invented their first product. But I sum it up in basic things. What is a group proposing to offer? So people have great new ideas in a company in whatever area they're in. If you can't answer every one of these questions at some point, you basically can't go into an innovative new business. What are we proposing to offer? Who do we think the customer is? What do we think the value is? Can we get to market even if the value is there? And then do we have a business model? And none of these in new disruptive things actually have definitive answers up front. They all require what I like to call, the industry calls it, agile, lean startup methodologies. You have to go out and prove, I have a hypothesis. It's kind of the scientific method applied to business. I have a hypothesis about these 3 things. I have to go prove it. I have a hypothesis about what people are willing to pay. I have to go prove that. I have a hypothesis about how we can really, grow in the market once these things are valued. I have to prove that, and then the business model. And largely, incremental approaches and incremental business plans rely on you answering all these questions with definitive data that's historical, right? This is what it is in the refrigerator business. This is the share. They make it for this much. If I can source it at this much, deliver it for this much, then, hey, I have a business. It doesn't work that way in disruptive new things, okay? So what do we do in our incubator, and give you some real examples? The first thing we do is I have corporate funding, seed corporate funding, and I'm watching the clock, so I should be pretty good. I have seed corporate funding where we take the best ideas that come up from different entities in the company, the executive committee, bottoms up employees, our own work. We put them through a filter, and we ask, are they a key trend that is a macro trend into that future view that I shared before? Is that a trend in an area that we think might or might not be relevant to us in the future? If so, are we talking about a new feature, a new accessory, a new product, or a new business? Because traditional businesses in a company are pretty comfortable with feature on what they already make, accessory to what they already sell, maybe a new product in the category they're already in. This is typically not a question they ask. I'm not in that business, right? So we look at it, we develop strategic hypotheses and assumptions, and then we go like a venture capital startup would go. We get it funded on a venture stage-gated or phase-based basis that says in Series A for $2 million over X amount of time, we're going to prove this part of it. Then we're going to prove the next part of it, and the next part of it, and the next part of it, and we're going to minimize our risk, because big companies like minimize risk, while we maximize our ultimate end goal. And it's a portfolio play. So I expect fewer of these to be successful, but I expect the ones that are to be really big and make up for the ones that weren't. And the growth will not be predictable. Hence, I need them to be really big. And this follows the venture capital formula, which many of you may know. It depends on the industry. But typically, out of every 10 businesses, 7 are a failure completely. One or two are just barely sustaining themselves. One is a modest success, and one is a home run. Okay? And then the choices here are, and I get asked this all the time, well, do you just give it to a business unit when you piloted this thing? It's great, now give it to a business. And the answer is, if you give it to a business, it's like putting a virus into the human body. The business will stamp that out about as quickly as possible. And the reason is simple. It's a distraction. It distracts. It's not what they do. It's not how they do it. It maybe doesn't even make money yet. Why in the world would they spend their time doing that? So bringing it into a business only makes sense when the business itself that you've created looks like an accessory or an adjacency. If it really is different, it doesn't make sense. So, of course, you can always cancel it, which is no news to people. You can create a new business unit. You can spin it off as an independent subsidiary operating under different operating processes than the parent company that are appropriate to the industry it's in. And GE is famous for doing this for years. And spin it out as a brand new company with venture capital financing or partners. I'm going to, in the remaining couple of minutes, give you a case study example in wearables. And I'm wearing one of them, wearable technologies. We looked at wearable technologies, and our senior executives said wearable technologies, big area of computing, part of IoT, Internet of Things, going to explode a couple years ago. And so, like technology, computer-oriented executives, they asked me to go to China and source wearables and bring them back, and hopefully they'd have some better speeds or feeds or battery life or whatever. And we said no. We said wearables are the original personal accessory. They've been around since the beginning of time. They're highly personal, and I'm talking here about consumer wearables, not commercial tools. And they've evolved, and only in the latter years of modern times have they become functional. But because you're all wearing different clothing, you're all wearing different watches, it's not all about function, okay? And we realized that, and we showed examples. How many of you knew most of the brands of glasses that you've ever heard of or that you wear, that your friends wear, it's all one company. It's called Luxottica. They have 80% market share in glasses, all right? Or Swatch in watches, and Fossil, which make many, many, many of the brands from really cheap to really expensive. Why do they make them? When they all tell time, they make them because you or people, their customers, essentially desire different things for different reasons. So we looked at that and we said, wearables are an evolution. People don't really want what you see up above, even though that's what the tech trends would tell you. What people really want is what they've always been buying. They're just going to expect it to be smarter. How many of you would buy a car right now that doesn't have an airbag? Would you buy a smart airbag car, or would you buy a car with an airbag? You following me? This is just part of being in the evolution of the business. So we went after this path right here. And what we did is we said, we will partner with a major designer, and in this case his name is Michael Bastian, a fashion brand. We will target his customers. We will take and make a watch that looks very traditional in his image of his customers, and we will add the minimum viable amount of smarts to it required to satisfy them in a reasonable way. We did that, and what ended up happening is we sold out our top product in 2 hours, and we sold out our bottom product in 1 month. And now we have a very long line of major brands in the world coming to us for what we call Engineered by HP to help them make their categories of products smart. These are typically companies that are not tech savvy, white box companies, consumer products companies, and other companies that realize that their products have to increasingly become smart. We took that and we parlayed it. I like to call it rinse and repeat. We now make all the smart watches for Movado, Coach, Tommy Hilfiger, Juicy Couture, Ferrari, on and on I could go. Titan's the biggest watchmaker in Asia, and Isaac Mizrahi in the United States. So we had a hypothesis, we started small, we proved it out, we pivoted it, and we ended up building the fundamentals of a business. So to tie it all up for you, because my bell's about to ring here, for your business in general, the things that I would recommend if you're really thinking about driving disruptive innovation are bring together the right mix of people. It's not just anybody. It's a mix of different kinds of people. You have to be fast and agile. That trumps speed, trumps efficiency and accuracy, the very things that you probably strive for in your mainline business. You need to have people who are willing to have the drive and determination. Why do I say that? There is no work-life balance at a startup. Okay, if your, well-being depends on making that thing work, when you go home, it shuts off. So when it's a group of people, 5, 8, 10, 12 people, it lives or dies by what they do, and so they have to be all in. You have to create the creative chaos in the environment to let the ideas percolate, and you have to create the friction that's necessary to stimulate that chaos turning into good ideas. Once you have those, it's really about hypothesis-driven strategies and value props that you test in a methodical, scientific way to come up with answers which you may or may not know in advance. And with that, I'll basically say thank you. So I apologize a little over.
So Doug, I think we have time to take a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
And I was, I was thinking as you're presenting, we've heard this anecdote a few times during the conference now about companies dropping out of the Fortune 500 or S&P 500 at maybe at increasing rates. And you're also talking then. So I think you described very eloquently some of the reasons for that and some of the things, with the incubator and the methodologies that you're talking about that you can use to mitigate some of the things that cause that. But at the same time, with the accelerating pace of innovation and that things are going to change more in the next 15 years than in all of human history, it sort of makes you wonder, is there any hope? Are you just sort of fighting a hopeless rearguard battle here to keep that? Or is there a way that older companies can actually continue to thrive?
Yeah, I'll give my answer to that because I'm at an older company. I'm at probably the oldest company in Silicon Valley right now. Our CEO, he's from Australia, and he's a surfer. I happen to be a surfer as well. And so we use a lot of wave analogies, like what we do today is wave 1, what we do tomorrow is wave 2, and what we do in the future, those are the waves way out there. We're not going to stop the waves. They're only going to get bigger, and they're only going to come faster. And the only question is, which one do you want to catch? That's fundamentally the nature. You can't fight nature. And in this case, we're talking about natural types of phenomena So for old companies, I really believe it's understand what you do and ask yourself a very hard question. What business am I in? Because what you make is not the business you're in. What you make happens to be how you make money today. In 5, 10, 15, 20 years, it could be very, very different. Or you might not be here.
Hi, I'm Laura Nearing with 3M. Great talk.
Sure.
Really fun to listen to. Were you on that team doing the wearables work?
Yes.
Okay, so how many of those can one do at a time? How do you manage the multiple things?
It depends on, it depends on corporate appetite. We did that entire wearables first level effort for an extremely small amount of money, like a laughable sum of money. And we did it with 2 core people and a cadre of third parties that helped us. So, whereas now that team is, orders of magnitude larger. So you can do 5, 10, 15, 20 of these, but in order to do that, you need the right loosely defined approach. The same way a venture capital company doesn't have a portfolio of 2 things, you need a portfolio. And there are some basic approaches to do that. But as a general rule, if you approach it as I'm going to do 1 or 2, and that's it, the laws of probability are really going to work against you.
How many were in the group? How many were in the group doing the 5 to 20?
How many people, you mean?
Oh, well, in general, what I do when we do an incubation is I start with 2 people. One is a technology lead who knows everything there is to know about the technology, the product, the mechanics. The other one is a business entrepreneurial lead, and they together are essentially the founders. And then they use the funds and the resources to make the rest happen. By the way, they beg, borrow, and steal because one of the things you might say by looking at that wearables example is, well, did you build the technology? And the answer was phase one wasn't about building anything. It was about proving the value prop. If we built the tech and failed, we would have just wasted money. So why build it if you don't have to? Until there's a reason to build it.
Okay. I think we've got time for one more question.
Yeah, hi. Peter Martulio, SRI. So how do you incentivize the team to stay and do that at HP as opposed to walk down the Sandhill Road and raise money from the VC?
That's a great question. And it's one, by the way, that we don't have a definitive answer for, that we're evolving as we go. But part of it is looking at different compensation schemes. Part of it is who you choose and how you choose them. Most of the, I don't want to use horrible anecdotes, but many people at startups are in their 20s in Silicon Valley, and there's a reason. They work 24 hours a day. They sleep under their desk. It doesn't really matter how much money they make, on and on and on. They don't have families and all the rest. So we look for people who have big company and entrepreneurial experience, typically in the middle of their career, who are really hungry to do new things, want some level of security associated with a large enterprise, but want to still do interesting, exciting things they feel passionate about. And that's how we do it. Okay?
All right. Thank you very much, Doug.
Thank you.